Hi, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Saab Johel, and I've worked as a psychologist for 30 years now, and as a clinician for 16 of those. And you can find out more about me if you check out the description for this video. And also, welcome to the first time to my channel, The Useful Psychologist, to my very special guest, collaborator, and fellow useful psychologist, all the way from London town, Dr. David Wesley. How are you today, David?
I'm great, thank you, Saab. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, yeah, it's my pleasure. We've known each other for a long time. Maybe you can tell people a
We
little
have.
bit about your psychology experience. What do you do right now?
As you said, I'm based in London in the UK. I work at Middlesex University, where I'm the head of Department of Psychology. As a psychologist, I've been interested in many things over my career, but most recently interested in how we can improve people's sense of their own psychological well-being, how we can help people to build their resilience for when times get tough.
Great. Thank you, David. And thank you again for joining me today. It's good to have you. And let's get straight into today's discussion, which is on what is known as imposter syndrome and ways that we might be able to tackle that. And I guess what imposter syndrome is known as is this kind of feeling perhaps where you don't feel like you belong, perhaps like your friends or colleagues are going to discover that you're a fraud. You've got that nagging away in the background. You don't feel like you actually deserve your job or your accomplishments. And so, it's actually really common. So if you do experience that, like many of us do, me included, then you're in good company. And I guess what people call imposter syndrome is also known as imposter phenomenon. And it goes something like this. You get a promotion at work. Your inner voice, your inner narrative tells you that it's because they were short of candidates. Your business has a great win and you tell yourself that it was sheer chance that the client found you. And you're getting ready to give a presentation, you secretly think that you're about to be found out for how hopeless you really are. All of this is familiar to me. And you're sitting at a big meeting and you know that the boss is going to walk in at any minute and tap you on the shoulder and tell you that they finally realize that you aren't actually qualified for the job and they'd like you to leave the room, even though you know at some level that you're the most experienced person in the room. And when you get this kind of experience, it can be really derailing. Even though they think around about 70% of people experience these imposter feelings at some point in their lives. And it used to be thought that perhaps it was limited to women, but now we know that actually it's much more widely experienced than that. People tend to call their success things like luck or good timing, and they kind of dismiss it as others believing that they're actually more intelligent than they really are. Like I said, I think I can really relate to this experience. And I'm just wondering, what's your experience of this, David, either in your own personal life or in the professional work where you're working with other people?
Um, well, personally, my own experience, I think, like many other people, I experience self-doubt, a little bit of a concern that somehow I might be challenged. I think I've experienced that a lot at academic conferences. If you're presenting some of your research, there's this nagging doubt that people are going to dismiss it. I have to say, I don't love the term imposter syndrome
Mm.
because it does make it sound a bit medical, like it's a clinical disorder. As you said, it's incredibly common for people at some point to kind of have an imposter experience. So I like the term imposter experience or imposterism. And it's something that I encounter sort of in day-to-day life quite a lot. I see it a lot in my students, students who are really capable and yet somehow don't take the feedback of their success as students. And in fact, the term imposter syndrome first came from research in the 1970s by Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, and they were particularly looking at women undergraduate students who, despite their high grades, were not believing they deserved to be there. In fact, some people even thought it might have been a mistake that they were admitted to their university course.
Yeah, and I think you make the really important point that it's not actually classifiable as a psychological disorder. It doesn't exist in that kind of realm of of thinking about what this experience is like. It's not highly unusual. It's actually quite common, but nevertheless, it's still distressing when you experience it, when you feel this
Sure, yes.
constant nagging self-doubt. It can actually get in the way of you perhaps taking opportunities in your life. And as a teacher, as a mentor, as a tutor, as you say, you must come across this quite a lot.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think people, it's a particular form of self-doubt that we're talking about here. And it's a form of self-doubt that people will very often conceal. And that actually adds to the problem. Because if people are concealing their self-doubt, but not imagining that other people might have that same self-doubt, then people don't have a context to see that, well, we often question ourselves and our capabilities. And if we do that in the right way, that can be really good for us. But if we do it in a way where we imagine we are the only people with self doubt, then that contributes to the feeling that, of imposterism, that we are imposters.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the things that you said there is that it can take many shapes and forms. And one of the ways that we may actually subvert ourselves and make the situation worse is by trying to conceal it and not actually taking the opportunity to perhaps understand and share this and in some way getting some feedback and understanding that you may not be the only one. But I think, and as we'll move on, that it's really important that we think about who we share that with. Because actually, if we're sharing it with the wrong people, it can actually make it worse. But anyway,
Mm.
before we get on to that, let's think about the sorts of situations, the sorts of types of imposter experience that people can experience. And I think that Valerie Young, who's considered an expert on imposter syndrome, found patterns in people who experienced imposter syndrome. And she used research and she's based this off data. So let's go through these one by one and just figure out what that might look like. So perfectionists, these are the people who set
Yes.
extremely high expectations for themselves, and even if they meet 99% of their goals, they're going to feel like failures. And any small mistake makes them question their own competence. I've certainly been through phases like this, and I see this in kids as well, in children who perhaps give themselves a really hard time when they make an error.
Well, I think perfectionism is certainly potentially part of imposterism, and again, it's enormously common and understandable. If we live in a world where actually people present themselves, for example, on social media, they present the highlights of their lives, they present airbrushed images, and that's what we're consuming. It's very easy to develop that sense of, gosh, we're not as good as other
Mm.
people. We don't live lives that are as successful or exciting. And again, I think this is really about sort of sticking just with our own internal dialogue. Our own internal evaluations, and not really getting hold of other sources of evidence which might present a less biased view of what we're capable of achieving.
Yeah, that kind of internal, just taking it off your own internal voice rather than actually thinking
Mm,
about, well, actually objectively, does that make much
mhm,
difference? So interestingly, the second one that Valerie talks about is this idea of experts. This idea that I need to know every piece of information before I'm going to start on a project. And they're constantly looking for new trainings and new certifications before they can get on and do something else. They won't apply for a job unless they meet absolutely every criteria in that job advertisement. And they may be hesitant to perhaps ask a question in class or to speak up in a meeting because they're afraid of looking stupid because they don't already know the answer. And I can see that actually this sort of perfectionism and needing to be an expert, as well as kind of underpinning this imposter experience, could actually be related to things like procrastination as well.
mm. Yeah, well, I think that self-doubt of all types can be incredibly inhibiting, can't it? It's if there's an underlying belief that we are fundamentally not good enough, or other people have skills that we don't yet have, uh, then actually the risk is that if you do something, then you might be found out, and that's what turns self-doubt into imposterism. It's not just having the self-doubt; it's the fear that somehow people will find that out. You'll be exposed as a fraud, or you'll be shamed for not having a certain skill or a bit of knowledge.
And I think actually that, yeah, as you say, it can be really paralyzing. It can actually stop people from getting in and
Mm,
doing new things because actually
mm,
by exposing myself here, I'm going to get found out. So I'm going to stick to the safe stuff. And
yeah.
that way I might be able to just kind of cruise beneath the kind of
Mm,
observation line. I won't draw visibility to myself.
mm,
And I think that's something that, we've talked about in my show before, and I'm sure you've seen this before, is this idea of kind of, do you praise the person or do you praise the behavior? And I think one of the categories that Value's come up with is this idea of the natural genius who perhaps has to struggle or work hard to accomplish something. Then he or she might think that actually it's because they weren't good enough. They didn't have the innate talent. They didn't have the trait to just kind of like knock it out the park first time round. And actually, the reality is that it doesn't come like that. Not for most people, it doesn't come like that.
yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. So people don't typically share all the details of how they got to their position of expertise or really high competence or really high achievement. So all we tend to see from other people is their level of performance. We don't see the history of hard work and struggle to get there because that's not apparent to us. That it reinforces those feelings of imposterism. Everyone else seems to find it so easy. Um, we don't know what their struggles have been to get there.
I've seen this meme going around recently, something along the lines of just because I can solve your problem in 30 minutes doesn't mean I'm not going to bill you for the 10 years of learning it took me to be able
Yeah,
to do that thing in 30 minutes. Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
So the fourth one is this idea of the soloist, the idea that actually I have to accomplish tasks on my own. And if I need to ask for help, somehow that means I'm a failure or a fraud.
Yeah, well, I think of that as one of the sort of cruelest lies of the 21st century, that somehow that people should be completely, if they are to be any good, they should do that entirely on their own. And ironically, exactly the opposite is true. That the people who are really successful are the people who are able to draw in support from others, who are able to ask for help, that realize that most successes are team efforts, they're collaborative efforts, and so to really, if you look at high achieving people, I mean, if I look at high achieving people in my field, they're not working on their own. They're really good at drawing in collaborators, at perhaps leading teams or being a really key member of a team.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is this kind of myth that actually we need to do it by ourselves, and we're encouraged to perhaps see ourselves in this individualistic society.
Mm,
But I guess
mm,
that I think one of the things is that we need to bear in mind is that actually it's more than just collaboration. There's this kind of idea in creativity, which I'm going to be talking about in a keynote that I'm doing in a couple of weeks, called collaboratarianism. So this is the
mm,
idea of actually working together, but being able to have a diversity of ideas that isn't threatening. You are able to be contrarian as well as being collaborative.
right.
And then this is where the fruit lies. This is where you get the gems. But actually, if you're feeling and you're burdened by this imposter experience, it's very difficult to put yourself safely into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. If we feel that our ideas might be attacked or they're not good enough, then that's going to stifle collaborative creativity. So if individuals or indeed groups don't feel free to have a diversity of opinion, it's a truism that they must remain stuck where they are.
Yeah. And I guess this idea, building upon this idea of the soloist, is the Superman or the Superwoman, pushing themselves to work harder than those around them to prove that I'm not an imposter. So I feel the need to succeed, not just in work, but in all aspects of my life, as work, at work, as a parent, as a partner. And I feel deeply stressed when I'm not accomplishing something all the time.
Yeah, and that's a particular sort of point of view on how we can define success. You could imagine other situations where people define their success as being part of a team or an organization that achieves a lot. So, so it's perhaps an unhelpful type of idea that success can only be defined narrowly as individual accomplishment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because the world is a lot wider than that, and also we move in so many different spheres as well. That actually, what we
Mm,
might experience is that in some aspects of our lives, we don't experience the imposter kind of phenomenon quite so much. But actually, there are certain contexts, there are certain conditions in which we really, really feel it amped up in our lives. So one example might be that actually I feel quite confident, perhaps talking to a group of more junior people, but talking to my peers, like in this kind of like academic conference situation, that could completely undo you. There's a completely different set of
yeah.
pressures that comes along there. Or perhaps
Mm,
you could be fine at work, but actually speaking up at a school meeting when it's about your kids could feel terrifying. It can bring up all kinds of memories
yeah.
about what do you say in front of the headmaster or whatever is going on for you.
Yeah.
So it's very context dependent, I think.
Well, it is context dependent, and of course, context that we're less certain about. It's natural. Uh, it's absolutely healthy to experience self doubt. It would, for me, it would be odd not to experience self doubt in a context where perhaps people know more than me or are on the same level as me. Self doubt. It's a component of self development.
And I think you're hitting on
Uh,
something quite
sorry.
key here, and absolutely, I think you're hitting on something really key in that this is part of the normal human experience, this experience of self doubt. And sorry, yeah, elaborate. What were you going to say, David?
Well, yeah, I think I'd already said it in the sense that in self development, we have to ask ourselves questions about um, where we are in terms of our achievements, and there's perhaps helpful ways to do that, and ways that are less helpful that can lead to the kind of self doubt that becomes inhibiting. Or really makes us very anxious about the security of our contributions to our situation.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, David, what your thoughts are on what you know about what seems to be at the root of why perhaps we experience this. Yes, there's the contextual dependence, but
Mm,
what is it that where we fail to kind of internalize this feedback that we might be getting around the world? That
mm,
actually, yeah, there are areas of our life where we don't know what's going on, and that's good to experience that self
mm,
doubt because that encourages
mhm,
you to develop in certain ways. But when we do know that actually perhaps we are quite good at something, but we fail to and we doubt ourselves in the face of this kind of incontrovertible evidence, where is this coming from?
mm. Well, I think there's lots of things that can feed into this sense of imposterism, but broadly speaking, they're all a kind of attentional bias. So how we feel about our situation is crucially dependent on what we pay attention to. And it's very easy to get caught up in paying attention to the things that are most threatening. Those are the most attention grabbing things in our environment. So if we've developed a concern that we might not be good enough, that people might identify our failings and call us out on those, then we're likely to be our attention is likely to be drawn to that possibility, to that kind of threat. I think some of the things that you've said have already hinted at how imposterism kind of develops. It's not paying attention to multiple sources of evidence, prioritizing one source of evidence, which is that voice of self doubt.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about there is this the sense of kind of who it is that you're interacting with in the relationships that you have, that kind of sense of belonging, the sense of safety, psychological safety. That's where you're less likely, I think, to have this provocation of these feelings of the imposter
Mm,
because
mm,
actually you don't have that threat detector. You're not looking out for those cues of this person.
mm,
Actually, I feel like they're looking at me like, what are you talking about? Sort of like thing. So when you are in situations and contexts where there is psychological safety, it seems to me like you probably be less likely to be experiencing this
mm.
phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. Threat is a very absorbing object of attention. If we don't feel the threat, then we're not so likely to worry about whether we are being an imposter, whether we're going to be seen as a fraud.
And then, of course, we have the bias, don't we? Because when we're feeling under threat, the bias is that actually this is something about me rather than perhaps the
Mm.
situation that I'm
Yeah,
finding
sure.
myself in. We actually
Yeah,
say, actually,
yeah,
this is much more about me. And where this kind of idea that it comes, that this is about me, may come from really quite deep rooted attachment based stuff, where it's like, well, actually, in order to be loved, I need to achieve. This is my bargain with the world, and that actually, in order to be
sure.
valued, I need to achieve. And actually,
Mm.
I think it comes back to what it is that you were saying before in terms of, is it just our accomplishments that give us value in the world, or are we bigger than that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's a cultural piece. If people kind of perceive the idea that our worthiness is dependent on our achievements or our status or even the objects that we possess, then actually there's going to be a lot of anxiety about how we're seen by others.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, how do we deal with this for people who experience these kinds of feelings of fraud, feelings of fakeness,
Mm.
feelings of being an imposter? How do we combat this? How do we tackle these feelings? And I guess that one of the things that I was looking at is one of these studies where it was looking at the coping strategies of college students who indeed perceive themselves as imposters. And they found that one strategy that helped people to see through these illusions of inadequacy was this idea that actually we can think about who it is that we are going to reach out to. So, those
Mm.
people who sought social support, for people who were not part of their peer group in which they felt an imposter, such as seeking the counsel and companionship of your family and your friends and your relationships, people who don't trigger your sense of not belonging or threat more widely. When you seek counsel from those people, it seemed to be able to help them to assuage and comfort themselves such that they didn't experience these feelings of being an imposter so strongly, and it enabled them to go and do other things.
Mm. Well, I mean, I don't think that finding is very surprising. I think one of the things that improves psychological well-being across the board is having some people that you trust, that you can turn to, that you can express feelings, perhaps talk through the reality of the situation. So actually disclosing your concerns to someone you trust is actually an opportunity to examine them a bit more closely than we would do necessarily in an internal dialogue.
Yeah. And I guess for people in a workplace where they're feeling that sense of imposterism, it's you have to be really careful about who it is that you disclose that to. I guess it follows then that you, in order to have that feeling of trust and perhaps not expose yourself to further threat within that organization, then perhaps one of the things you might want to think about is actually seeking counsel, seeking support, perhaps through your family and friends, or if that doesn't feel like it's going to do it for you, then developing that trusted relationship in some other kind of mentoring or social support relationship that's going to be able to give you that feedback objectively, but someone who you're going to listen to and actually value their judgment and not dismiss it as well. You would say that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So having someone whose judgment you trust, and someone you trust to sort of hold and manage your feelings, can be helpful. If we think about what imposterism is, it's the fear of being found out. So people are much less likely to disclose in that situation. It feels like a risk unless they can really trust the person they're talking to.
One of the other things they found in this study, in a series of studies, was that actually, I guess I can term it as big fish, small pond. And so when you're a
Right.
big fish and you're achieving very well and highly, and there's something of a small pond, and you're used to that
Mm,
environment, let's say you're in school, and then suddenly
mm,
you go to college, and you're suddenly not a big fish in a small pond, you're in a big fish with lots of other big fish
mm,
in a medium-sized pond, and you're bumping into these big fish the whole time, and actually suddenly you get feelings of actually perhaps I'm not so special. Actually, perhaps
mm,
I'm not so good because everybody else seems to be really, really good. So maybe my level of goodness is not as high as I thought it was. And they think that actually these are the sorts of conditions that can give rise to these feelings of imposterism when you move from one context where perhaps you are, if you're valued for your achievement, you're being valued highly, and suddenly you move to another context where if you value your achievement, suddenly you feel like perhaps you're not as achieving as much in comparison to others. And I think it comes back to one of your earlier points in that actually, where do we draw our information from in terms of how we feel about our own proficiency, our own happiness?
Yeah, well, I mean, in one sense, the only way that we can evaluate ourselves is in the context of what we see around us. So if people are experiencing a sense of imposterism, uh, I would suggest one strategy might be to actually actively think about how you gather your evidence and what sources of evidence might be biased. I think just simply acknowledging that imposterism is very common is really helpful. People can come to understand that they might be surrounded by people who have very similar feelings of imposterism, and I think that uh, helps people understand their context a little bit better, even if now they're meeting people with the same capabilities and the same types of experience as them.
So I think it comes back again to something you were talking about, this idea of self-doubt being very common. And
Mm,
actually, maybe when people do doubt themselves and when they're moving from one situation and they suddenly find themselves amongst a whole bunch of highly functioning people, that actually this isn't necessarily a reason to doubt yourself. Actually,
no,
attributing your feelings of actually this feels quite different. The fact is that you're
mm,
with a completely different bunch of people who perhaps are functioning at a much higher level, perhaps closer to where you're functioning. And the difference that you're experiencing between you and yourself is now not your source of self-esteem that it used to be.
yes, well, I think generally, well, there is evidence that imposterism is more prevalent in situations where people are pioneers, and so that means that imposterism might be more prevalent amongst underrepresented groups, groups that have traditionally been marginalized, because people, sort of feel um, not equipped perhaps for the situation. And when people are pioneers, it's hard to sort of take strength from the experience of people who've gone before because they're not there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's becoming more and more apparent as the research is telling us that actually it's that sense of belongingness. And there's many different ways of cutting that belongingness in that sense. It may be through gender, it may be through ethnicity,
Mm,
it may be through class, it may be through geographical origin. All sorts of different
mm,
ways of actually seeing yourself as actually not really feeling like you belong because there
mm,
weren't people who went before you, there are no peer groups, and you don't see other people coming up underneath you as well.
no,
So, really thinking
yeah.
about your reference group and who do you
Mm,
reach into? And are you reaching into a group that you don't actually feel like you belong in, which actually then
mm,
amplifies your feeling of imposterism? Or are you reaching out and perhaps helping to develop other people, but also reaching broader out? If your group isn't in your field of study, your field of work, then who is around that you can reach out to as your source of support?
absolutely, yes.
David, is there anything else that you know about your experience with your students or what it is that you've done that's perhaps worked for you, as well as kind of that inner kind of, challenging yourself to, where am I getting my evidence for this feeling that I'm having? What's causing it? Is there anything else that you've experienced in your life or students have told you about that's been helpful for them?
Gosh, I'm going to have to think about that. I think that often as psychologists, we're always interested in what individuals can do to overcome the difficulties they experience. It's funny that people who experience particularly a sort of perfectionist kind of
Mm.
imposterism might listen to this conversation and think to themselves, "Gosh, I'm not doing enough to get over my imposter syndrome." And so perhaps as psychologists, we shouldn't just think about what individuals can do, but actually what organizations and groups can do. So perhaps not so much in relation to imposterism, but certainly perfectionism. That's a discussion I will often have with groups of students so they can share their experiences of that and actually feel that it's quite a common experience, but by sharing and perhaps sort of listening to each other compassionately, overall that reduces those feelings. So if we think of imposterism as a fear that someone will be found out, if we can create compassionate environments for people to express their self-doubt, to try out ideas that may or may not work, then we're going to create an environment which reduces that sense of imposterism.
Thank you so much, David. That's a great note for us, for us to end this conversation. It's been really, really good talking to you today. And if you're watching now still, thank you. Well done for making it this far. Please let us know in the comments below what's resonated with you. What did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Do you have any tips that you've learned yourself for those of us experiencing imposter syndrome and wondering what to do about it? How do you manage it yourself and what's worked for you? We'd love to hear your stories. And we hope to be back again soon. And I'd love to have you again on the show again, David. It's been great today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sab.